Okay, so we are going to be talking today about the lesson that goes along with the periodic table. Again, in the last online lecture, I described the periodic table as your best friend in this class because it's going to be so useful. You're going to be using it all the time. So let's talk about the components of the periodic table. So the periodic table is first organized by atomic mass. And these are the consecutive, I can spell, whole numbers associated with the elements on the periodic table. So the atomic number is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus of an element. So that's the defining feature of an element, is the number of protons that are in the nucleus. So we need a little bit of vocabulary for this. The periodic table vocabulary that we can use is, the first word is group, and this is the vertical column on the periodic table. Column on the periodic table. And elements that are in a group, they're oftentimes called families. So elements in a group are a family because they have similar chemical properties. And when we get into atomic structure, we'll figure out why that is. So elements in a group have similar chemical properties, similar reactivity. They'll react with things in the same ratio. So these are very similarly, elements in a group behave very similarly. And the period is just the horizontal row on the periodic table. This is far less useful for us in terms of determining the properties of an element. So the group is the big one here. So I'm going to ask you at some point, I may have already, to color your periodic table in terms of metals and nonmetals. So we have this nice little staircase that I will color blue. Starts here and goes all the way down here. And this line is super important because it splits up the metals and the nonmetals. So this whole area over here, including the elements that we almost never talk about down here, the lanthanides and the actinides, these are all considered metals. Right? So when they're elemental, when they're by themselves, they will exist as metals. But you'll say, Mr. Bennett, sodium chloride, sodium's a metal, but salt isn't a metal. Well, that's because salt is a compound, and we'll talk about how that's different coming up. So H is hydrogen, is a nonmetal, as are the elements on the right-hand side of the periodic table. Those are nonmetals. So this line, this staircase, divides metals and nonmetals. All right. Now, we also get this interesting group right along the staircase. We have these things called metalloids. And when I give you the periodic table to color, you'll color those indifferently. Metalloids are not things that we talk about all that much in this class. They have properties of both metals and nonmetals. The most interesting one for us probably is silicon. Silicon is a part of all the electronics that we use because it has properties of metals and nonmetals that allow for flow of electricity in a certain way. So now underneath this, draw another. It doesn't. Your period. The things that you draw here don't have to be perfect. Just vaguely understand that we have. Draw this underneath, because now we're going to talk about some specific parts of the periodic table, some specific groups. Really, well, sort of specific groups, but this group, this last one, I'm using purple because these are the noble gases. These noble gases, they are unreactive. They don't want to play with anybody. They're noble like the king. They're above and beyond anything else. They don't need anyone's help to exist. They're stable as they are, and they're very unreactive. Okay, so we have in the middle here, these are all from here to here are the transition metals. Now, the thing about the transition metals, they don't follow the trends we're going to learn about the periodic table. The transition metals don't follow them perfectly. Everything from column 1 to 2, and you'll see this is called 3b through 8b. You also might see it 13 to 18. Those follow the trends pretty well, but the transition metals don't follow necessarily the trends that we're going to talk about. We'll find later on that these are our most reactive metals, not must reactive, most reactive. And these are our most reactive nonmetals. These are things that are not particularly stable on their own. Okay, so a little bit more. This is going to be our longest lecture, online lecture to date. So metals are elements that have the following properties. They are solid, with one exception. That is the liquid that is mercury. They're normally silver or gray. They're usually shiny. So even if you look at mercury, mercury liquid is still shiny. They are malleable, which is basically a way they are shapeable. You can make them into different shapes. Gold is something that's used for jewelry. Gold's a metal. It can be bent and made into other shapes. If you think back into like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, swords, the advent of metallurgy was hugely important for civilizations because they could make things like swords, and then above and beyond they could make things to build houses or tools that they can use. And also metals conduct electricity. And we'll talk a lot about this as a property of a metal moving forward and why that is. Nonmetals are actually much more diverse in their properties. They can be solid, liquid, or gas. So gas, an example being oxygen or nitrogen. Solid would be something like carbon. Liquid, we have liquid iodine. So it can be solid, liquid, or gas. As a solid, if they're a solid, they're normally very brittle, which means they don't bend, they break. They're not shiny, and they're also not shiny or conductive. So if you've gone, I should have said this earlier. But if you've gone over, you just go on to the next page, cross out the left-hand side, write more on the right-hand side, and whatever page number we're on, just put like an A next to it. So if for example, if this were page, I know it's probably going to be like page 12 or 14, put 14A on the next page. Okay. So now the other parts, the noble gases, these are the unreactive elements on the far right column. So these are the ones, they're noble, they're like royalty, they don't mix with the other common elements. And the transition metals are the elements in the middle of the periodic table. So, oh, wow. So, you know what? We already did all this. We did this and this, so you don't need to worry about this. But, we didn't talk about metalloids yet. So, just copy this last one down, that metalloids are the elements between the metals and the nonmetals, and they're found along the stair-step line, and they have properties of both. So they can't be easily put into one column or the next. Okay, so this is our last lecture before the quiz on this material. So wrapping up this lesson, so the question we studied was, what information does the periodic table reveal about the elements? That you get patterns that repeat on the periodic table. It's organized so that each column has similar properties, or the elements in each column have similar properties. The periodic table lists name, symbol, and average atomic mass. Also, it lists the atomic number. On our periodic tables, it also has something called electronegativity, which is a long, scary word, but is really not that, well, it's a confusing concept, but one we'll get to. Several groups of elements and some periods have specific names. We didn't really talk about the halogens. The halogens are the group right before the noble gases. I'm most concerned with you knowing the noble gases. Metals are in the center and left. Non-metals at the top right. The dividing line are considered the metalloids.